It is working. Okay, so good evening, everyone. Although, you know, with the light getting later and later, it doesn't look like evening yet. We are going to begin a Jewish history overview. Now, you might be wondering, why do I need to know Jewish history? Right? I need to know Torah, I need to know the mitzvot, and that's all I need. Well, Jewish history is really very important. Partly because the story of our people helps us. Oh, that's fine. It's a nice night. If you're cold, you can close it. Because partly because the story of our people helps us understand what God wants from us, how God wants us to live, and the life that we are trying to achieve. Partly also because the story of our people helps us understand why Judaism looks the way it looks now. And that process is a chain. That's why, as you see, I titled it One Long Story. It isn't like someone was Jewish and then stopped, and then someone rebooted it and then stopped, and then someone rebooted it. This isn't like Spider-Man movies, where they make a few stop and then start it up all over again. This is one long, constant process of Judaism existing in different times and adjusting within the limits of Torah to what was needed for those times. And if you don't know that pattern, a lot of what we do looks really strange. And also you will be missing some of the meaning behind those patterns. But we're going to start at the beginning, because that's the only place to start. And I mean in the beginning, at the beginning. You can't understand Jewish history without understanding the beginning of the Torah. There's a very famous discussion in Jewish Midrash of why does the Torah start with Genesis? Why does it start with in the beginning? Shouldn't it start with the commandments that come when we leave Egypt during the Exodus? And the answer is that we need to know everything that happened before to make sense of everything that happened later. Because you might think, a bunch of stories in Genesis, right? We have circumcision and don't murder people and don't tear the limb off something while it's still alive. But we could have just mentioned those at Mount Sinai. We didn't need a whole book. This history is very important. So what do we know from this history? Well, we know that God created everything. That God created the whole universe. There was no universe before God began to create. That is part of God's credentials. That's part of what gives God the right to tell us how we should live our life. And we know that when God created us, that when God created humanity, that he created us in his image. As we talked way in the very first class, obviously God doesn't have a body. Therefore, when we say created in God's image, we're not talking about a physical shape. We are talking about a spiritual capacity that is linking us towards godliness. And that gives us a hint about what God was trying to do with us that was different than what God was trying to do with anything else in creation, right? God didn't create the table in his image. God did not create donkeys in his image. God created humans in his image, and that meant that we have a particular role to play within this world. As you'll remember, it says that God formed us from the dirt of the ground and blew into our nostrils the breath of life. And that is what made us become a living creature. And it's that unique hybrid that we are, that link between heaven and earth, where we are sort of a bit of both, that gives us the calling of humanity. Plus, the very famous eating of the fruit. Where it says that, we ate from the fruit in the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God says, look, they've become like one of us, right? Knowing good and evil. Someone else here? That's a good person. You'll let her in, right? Yes. Okay. That God says that they become like us, meaning they become more godlike in knowing good and evil. And that means that we now have responsibility, right? Knowledge of choices equals responsibility. It's the same thing that we expect from humans in our own life, right? If someone knew that they were stepping on your foot and they continued to step on your foot, you're angrier than someone who's stepping on your foot and don't know that you're stepping on your foot, right? A knowledge of a situation, knowledge of what is good, knowledge of what is bad creates responsibility. And that is what happened when we ate that fruit. And that's why we are traveling in this world. But what God says very, very clearly in the story of Cain, when Cain's getting angry about his brother Abel getting more response from his sacrifice, he says, why are you angry? Right? Why is your face fallen? Surely if you do well, there will be lifting up. Right? But if you do not do well, sin crouches at the door. Its longing is for you, yet you can master it. And this is the fundamental element of the human condition, which is it's very easy to make mistakes and it's very easy to trip, but we have the ability to overcome it. And with that as the key, God is now looking for humanity to overcome that. Cain, whoops, we have a problem? No, we're okay. It's my tech support. Because of course we know right after God gives Cain this speech, Cain goes and kills his brother. So he doesn't quite master his anger. He doesn't control it well enough. And that becomes the problem. So we see, Lord saw that the evil of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And God regretted that he'd made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. God sees that after these 10 generations from Adam until Noah, things are going the wrong direction. Humanity is becoming more and more gifted in being bad rather than gifted in overcoming their badness. And God is planning to start again, right? Sort of wipe the page clean and begin again. And in this case, it's going to be with Noah, right? These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generation, and Noah walked with God. And God said to Noah, with you, I will establish my covenant. God is trying to find somebody with whom he can build a relationship that will spread to the next generation and spread to the next generation and next to next, so that we will eventually have universal understanding of our purpose in life, our connection to God, and make the right choices. Notice that God, because we have the choice, God can't just come in and force us to do good. All that God can do is instruct us in how to do good. And then it is up to the individual to choose good or not good. Doing all right so far? Yep. All right. We just went 10 generations, so that was a blink of an eye. And now we went another 10 generations, because after Noah, it doesn't work out so well, right? Immediately after Noah gets off the ark, we've already got trouble with one of his sons, and the people begin to have other troubles, Tower of Babel story, and all sorts of other things happening. There isn't a continual flowing from Noah into his children in order to establish a reliable connection with God and people reliably understanding and choosing to do good. So Abraham comes along, and there's a great little summary that I'm going to be taking for the next few slides from Nehemiah, where he gives a little bit of a short history of everything. This is also part of the morning Psuke de Zimra, the preliminary service, because it's a nice reminder of Jewish history. And what he says what Nehemiah says is, you alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, the highest heavens and all their hosts, the earth and everything upon it, the seas and everything in them. You keep them all alive, and the host of heaven prostrate themselves before you. Sounds like all of Genesis, right? The beginning part of creation. You are the Lord God who chose Avram and brought him out of Ur of the Chaldeans and changed his name to Avraham. Right? We got the little encapsulated story of Abraham there. Finding his heart true to you, you made a covenant with him to give the land. So we saw a covenant with Noah, which didn't quite continue on very well. That is to say, there's still a requirement for basic righteousness and goodness among the children of Noah, but there's not such a great remembering of humanity's part of that covenant. And now God is trying again, this time with Abraham. Notice the big change here. God is not wiping out the world and starting over again. God is going to try and work with this guy and build up a family through him that will have a particular place and a particular way of living that will fulfill what God is hoping, which is that good choice of a good soul within the world as a continuous growth of a family, a nation, a community, on and on. Got the plan? Okay. But Abraham is unable to make it grow the way God really wants, right? With Lot, Abraham can't keep Lot in the group, and Lot ends up off in Sodom and Gomorrah. And then in the next 2 generations, he can't keep both of his sons. He only keeps Isaac, and Ishmael goes off a different path. With Jacob coming along as the son of Isaac, again, only one son, Jacob, stays on the path, and Esau forks off. We are not getting universal continuation, but we are getting some continuation. So it's slowly building, but it's not building the way we want it to do. And that 3rd generation, the children of Jacob, looks like it's going to have the whole catastrophe again. Remember, they sell Joseph off into slavery, and it's not really looking good. But then, of course, there's a reconciliation. The family is reunited. And finally, we stop splitting. That is a major turning point in Jewish history, is we are now actually a group that is going to continue with the full generation after generation after generation without having everybody splitting off constantly. We'll still lose a few here and there, unfortunately, but the majority of the family is now big enough that it will continue moving forward as a family, or indeed as a nation. And this is, in fact, where the book of Genesis comes to an end. The book of Genesis, in one way of reading it, is all about how God finally got a group of people who were stable and connected, that could be a people that he could now give Torah to, that he could give a more detailed set of instructions that they could then carry forward. Rather than relying on individual prophets or wise people, we've now got a whole community that is prepared for this. The only problem, of course, is they're stuck in Egypt. So we have to get the Exodus, which we're about to celebrate with Pesach. Again, continuing from Nehemiah, you took note of our father's affliction in Egypt and heard their cry at the Sea of Reeds. You performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants and all the people of his land. You split the sea before them. They passed through the sea on dry land, but you threw their pursuers into the depths, like a stone into the raging waters. You led them by day with a pillar of cloud and by night with a pillar of fire to give them light in the way they were to go. That's not just trying to talk about light like a flashlight. That is, of course, also using the idea of light in the way to go as saying that God is trying to show us the right way to live, to lead us out of Egypt, not just like go this way, but lead us in life, meaning go this way, choose this kind of path, which of course takes us to Sinai. And God explains very clearly, right? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I, the Lord, your God. God is trying to make it very clear, not only here, but in many parts of the Torah, that the purpose of the Exodus was not only to give us freedom, but it was to make us free so that we could be God's people, so that we could have the Torah and have this special relationship, this covenant that would make our people able to live a better life and have a future that would be better rather than just falling apart. Make sense so far? Good. Nehemiah sums it up nicely. You came down on Mount Sinai and spoke to them from heaven. You gave them right rules and true teachings, good laws and commandments. You made known to them your holy Shabbat. You ordained for them laws, commandments, and teaching through Moses, your servant. You gave them bread from the heaven, the manna, when they were hungry. You produced water from a rock when they were thirsty. You told them to go and possess the land that you swore to give them. But they, our ancestors, acted presumptuously. They stiffened their necks and did not obey your commandments. See the golden calf. And many other incidents, but that's specifically what Nehemiah is talking about in this context and what we read about just in the last Torah reading. And that was kind of, or the week before last, that was kind of a big problem because it showed that we were not going to consistently follow. This is the new stage, and this is going to set the pattern for the next few hundred years of Jewish history, which is we have now finally come together enough that we are going to be a people. Remember, we started off with one family, Adam and Eve, and that didn't quite work into building one people. And then God finally got Abraham to sort of stick. But then we finally, with Jacob's children, got a group, the whole tribes, that would be a bigger group that would stick. Now he just needs Torah to stick. He needs them to actually behave right. At least they're still linked together. At least they're still thinking about God, but they're not always acting correctly. And that becomes the next barrier, which brings us to the period of the judges. Again, Nehemiah, he does a great summary, so why not use the classics? The sons came and took possession of the land, that is to say, the descendants of the people who left Egypt. You subdued the Canaanite inhabitants of the land before them. You delivered them into the power of their adversaries. You oppressed them. In their time of trouble, they cried to you. You in heaven heard them, and in your abundant compassion gave them saviors, the different judges and warriors, who saved them from the powers of their adversaries. But when they had relief, they again did what was evil in your sight. So you abandoned them to the power of their enemies, who subjugated them. Again, they cried out to you, and you in heaven heard and rescued them in your compassion, time after time. So if you've ever read the book of Judges, you'll know that this is the pattern that goes back over and over again. There's a problem, the people cry out, a new hero rises, we are saved, and things are good, and then we fall apart again. And we turn aside from the path that God has given, and then bad things happen to us, and then we cry out, and then a new hero comes, and then we are saved, and then we do good for a while, and then it falls apart again. The cycle goes over and over and over. And that's the churning history of the book of Judges. So we're still looking for a way to make it stick. Doing so far, so good? Okay. And that leads us to an idea from the people, which is what we really need is not just hoping there'll be a new hero. We need to breed heroes. We need a king. We need someone who will be in charge, and they'll stay in charge, and their kids will be in charge, and that'll make everything better. So, from the book of Samuel, all the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel, and they said to him, "You've grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways." The sons of Samuel were not good guys. Appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations. Now, hopefully we can see with the benefit of hindsight the problem with this, right? If they're worried that Samuel's sons aren't good, why do they think the sons of a king are going to be good, right? If the problem is that there's no reliable succession, do you honestly think that the sons of kings are going to be more reliable than the sons of a prophet? The problem is you can't count on genetics to build the next generation of leaders. But they want to be like the other nations. They've seen other nations. They've seen that other nations seem to be happy with having their king. They aren't really, but it looks that way when you don't have a king. And so, as it says, Samuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied, "Heed the demand of the people and everything they say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected, it is me. They have rejected as their king," right? God is supposed to be the king, and we're saying we'd like a person to be our king. And you can imagine that's going to create a problem. It's hard to have two kings. And which one are you supposed to serve? So, like everything else they have ever done, or done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so they are doing to you. Sorry, Samuel, this is what it feels like. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over them. If you've never read this section of Samuel, go back and read it, because it's an amazing statement about what happens with rulers and politics and all of that. And it's 3,000 years old, and it's still very, very true. All right, so we end up with Saul, and after Saul, King David. Saul was the first king of Israel. He was deeply flawed as a person. He was not a great person. But his biggest problem was that he didn't follow God's commands. If God told him to do something, he didn't always do it. The most famous example is when he was fighting the Amalekites and decided to take the loot, to take the treasure, rather than destroying it the way God had commanded him to do. And that was when he ultimately, finally was written off as going to be the king. Because according to the Torah, according to Jewish thinking, according to this whole pattern from the beginning, we are supposed to always remember that God is above, not the king. And most kings want to be above God, right? They want to be in charge of the religion so they can use it to control the people. They don't want the religion to be in charge of themselves in order to control themselves. And that's one of the fundamental problems. And Saul really shows that problem most strongly. David comes along, he does better. He is a warrior, yes, but he also has a more gentle and open soul. He is interested in God. He writes psalms, he writes songs. And when he makes mistakes that are only mistakes by God's rules, not by the rules of kings, he is still sorry. And that is unusual. That is exceptional. Usually if the king makes a mistake and it's only a mistake in God's book, the king just rewrites God's book. David wasn't that kind of king. The most famous example, of course, with Bathsheba, where he said, I did wrong. Now, by the rules of the ancient world, a king taking someone else's wife, that's normal. Right? The kings do that all the time. They kill the husband, take the wife, they're king. What are they going to say? But David was willing to regret what he had done, willing to look to God as saying, what God has told me to do, I need to do better. Make sense?
But he wasn't punished for it.
Well, he wasn't. Right? So the Torah, the Tanakh has a great way of giving us information about what happens to a person without putting a big label on it that says punishment. But if you look at what happens to David's life afterwards, although he himself straightens up and makes himself a better person, the fights within his home that come from the mothers of these different children are horrific. One of his daughters gets raped, one of his sons gets murdered, one of his other sons rebels, another son is trying to become king before he's even dead. Those are the burdens that he bears because of what he began to do with Bathsheba. Was he punished, flogged? No. Was he punished because there was a giant booming voice from heaven or a lightning bolt? No. But did his family bear the problems that he created by acting in this way? Did it turn his household into something similar to the other kingly households of other nations? Yeah. And in that way, he did bring punishment into his own home. So it can sometimes be difficult because the Torah doesn't, or the Tanakh doesn't always say, and God punished him, ... But you can see the consequences of his behavior by how his family behaves after him, how they follow in his example, which is not a good example. Okay. And then Solomon comes along, who is the not the firstborn of King David, but is the one that King David chooses to become king after him. And this mostly makes the transition easy. And the most famous thing we know about Solomon, of course, is that when God asks him, what do you want? Solomon says, well, what I really would like would be to have wisdom. I'm now king, as it says, of this entire nation. And that's a pretty big job for someone. And I need the knowledge and the understanding to be able to be a good king. And God says, you can have it. And you also get the other stuff you didn't ask for, the glory and the riches and the life and all of that, if you walk in my ways and observe my laws and commandments. Right? So there's a little bit of a condition at the end. Unfortunately,
as did your father David said.
Yes, exactly.
So despite, but I know that what was said all about David and his household and everything. David was still revered,
of course,
as the example,
of course,
to follow.
You don't need a perfect person to be your example. What you need is somebody who makes a mistake and then tries to fix it to be the example. That is the better example. We see that throughout Jewish history. We don't find people who are perfect from the beginning and stay perfect the entire time as being our role models. We see people like Judah, who made horrible mistakes, both with Joseph and then with Tamar, who fixes his mistakes. Those are the people that we hold up and say, this is someone we should learn from. Not that we should learn from the bad things they did, but learn that even though they did bad things, they fixed them and they tried to improve their life. And with that, David was a really good example, and a very good example of a king who was willing to be humble. But to be humble, he had to first make mistakes. So David was very close and walked with God in better than any other king we ever had. Not because he was always perfect or blameless, but because he was always trying to be better. And that is the example that we want. Solomon, unfortunately, starts off kind of okay, but throughout his expansion and building of his kingdom and his building of the alliances with neighboring kings, where he brings in their daughters to become his wives, he ends up with idolatry. He ends up building the temple, yes, and building fortresses and palaces, but he does it by forcing the people to work very, very hard. It's almost like turning the nation into slaves for him. And when he dies, the people want relief. They go to his son, Rehoboam, who is going to be the new king, and they say, hey, your father made our yoke heavy, right? Your dad really worked us to death. He taxed us, and it was getting really, really bad. Lighten the harsh labor and the heavy yoke which your father laid on us, and we will serve you. So the people are just coming to this new king, the prince, who's now king, and saying, your dad was kind of getting tough and a bit nasty when he was getting old. So do you think you could maybe make things easier for us? And he answered them, go away for 3 days and then come back. Basically, give me time to think about it. So King Rehoboam took counsel with the elders. These are the people who were the wise ones that had been working with his father and trying to make things better. And the elders say to him, if you will be a servant to these people today and serve them, meaning if you do what the people are asking, and if you respond to them with kind words, they will be your servants always. Right? Basically, if you treat the people with respect, the people will respect you, and this will create a better kingdom. But he ignored their advice, and instead he took counsel with the young men who had grown up with him and were serving him. He went to his drinking buddies, basically, and they said to him, say to them, tell the people, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins, which shouldn't need too much translation, but basically he's saying, I'm even more macho than my dad, right? And if you thought my dad was tough, wait till you get a load of me, right? Loins are this area of a person. And so my little finger is bigger than my dad's. He is incredibly crude and rude in what he's describing here, but he doesn't want to look weak in front of the people. So he said, so the advice is, my father imposed a heavy yoke on you. I will add to your yoke. My father flogged you with whips. I will flog you with scorpions. Not literally, but basically, I'm going to treat you even harder than my dad treated you. Ha ha! And this leads to civil war. The kingdom breaks because of this. And 10 tribes are now broken away to the north. And only Judah and Jerusalem in the south remains as part of Rehoboam's kingdom, as part of David's kingdom. And this becomes now the new norm. We have a northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Got that? All right. So remember, as I said a few slides ago, one of the big points was trying to get the group of people to stick together so that we would be able to follow God. And what happened was, kings kind of broke it. They overworked the people, they treated them badly, and then the people didn't want to stick together anymore. And now we end up with this split. And the northern kingdom becomes idolatrous. They still talk about God, but they also add in all sorts of other foreign gods. And the southern kingdom is mostly devoted to God, to Adonai, but depending upon who's king, they also have other shrines and they have other altars, and people also worship other things. So it's not really perfect in either kingdom, but the north is considered worse than the south. All right. All right. So that leads ultimately to the fall of the north. There were many, many prophets who came for hundreds of years to warn the northern kingdom that they had to stick with God, right? Cleave to God. But instead, they worshipped idols. They broke all the rules of morality. And that means they were murdering people. They were stealing from people. They were abusing the poor. They were doing everything you could imagine that a corrupt and horrible society would do. They were doing. And they were doing it officially. This wasn't, like Somalia, where there's no law, no government. This was part of their culture. This is just how you behave. And so in 722 BCE, the Assyrian Empire came down, and it had already sort of conquered it, but now it completely destroyed the northern kingdom, and it carried off the majority of the people, like the vast majority of the people. That was Assyrian policy back there. The empire would conquer a country and take the people and move them, so that way the people would not be able to rebel against them. They wouldn't have any connection to their land, and that was the Assyrian way of trying to keep people from revolting. And those tribes are lost. Right? The people who were from the northern kingdom were just scattered into the Assyrian Empire, and they are gone. They are a mystery. So we unfortunately have lost that huge portion of what was our people. And then the southern kingdom, right? 586. So we're looking at almost 100 and some years later. I can't do the math fast enough. Yeah, 100 and something. The southern kingdom of Judah, which was able to stand up to Assyria long enough that they didn't get conquered. They ended up paying them a lot of money, but they didn't get conquered. In 586, they do get conquered by the Babylonians. And that was mainly because they had tried to make a deal with Egypt. The Judeans thought that Judah and Egypt could work together to fight against the Babylonians. The only problem was only we showed up to the fight. The Egyptians stayed home. It's kind of like somebody, it's like saying, me and my big brother, we're not gonna stand up. We're not gonna let you do what you're doing, blah, blah, blah. And then you turn around and like, wait, where's my big brother? And Babylon destroyed us. They destroyed the first temple. And they carried a huge portion of us into Babylon in captivity. But this is where things get different. Right? Without a temple or a homeland, we might have fallen apart, like the northern kingdom. Right? When they were scattered into Assyria, they fell apart. When we are taken into Babylon, we don't. Instead, we build communities, essentially expat communities in Babylon, where we use the Torah, where we read from the Psalms, where we do the mitzvot together, and this binds us to God and to each other. So when I said at the outset that we need to understand history to understand much of what we do, this, for example, is where the synagogue is born. Prior to this, yes, people could say a prayer wherever they were, and people had to do the mitzvot wherever they were, but the main community focus in the days of Judaism before this was always the temple or the Mishkan. You went there for a sacrifice, you went there for the festivals. Now, because we don't have a temple, because we don't have even our own homeland, we are forced to restructure the way that we think about how we serve God. And you'll notice that what we end up with is the essence of what God was trying to teach us all along. That it isn't just about the sacrifices and the Mishkan and the temple, but it's about following the commandments, about understanding Torah, about living the right way and doing it linked together so that we can support each other. And this Babylonian experience, in a way, clears up a lot of our problems and helps us get stronger in our connection to God. A few other things that happen, for example, we also adopt the Hebrew font that we use even to this day, because it's a lot easier to write than the old Hebrew font, which was much more carvy style, hammer, chisel writing. You can look it up. It's really interesting to see the old style versus the new. And then the Babylonians, they get beaten up. Right? It's the story of the ancient empires, right? The Assyrians beat up a lot of people, then the Babylonians beat up the Assyrians, then the Persians beat up the Babylonians. There's also the Mede Empire in there in the middle, but we don't need to go into that. And the Persians have a different policy. The Persians allow us to return to Israel, or Judea as it was called, and we begin rebuilding 70 years after that destruction. So we are still part of the Persian Empire, but we kind of have control over our own little area. Now, this is not the area of Solomon. This is the area of Judah, the southern kingdom. So it's a very small kind of kingdom, and it's not independent. We are like a state within the Persian Empire. Make sense? Good. But the Persian Empire is more tolerant. They allow us to practice our religion without interference, as long as we pay taxes, as long as we don't try to fight and do other problems. Okay. Alexander the Great comes along, right? So we had Assyrians beaten up by Babylonians, beaten up by the Persians, and Alexander the Great beats up the Persians. And this happens around the year 332 BCE. And when he beats up the Persians, he gets us too, right? We're part of the empire. So when he beats them up, he takes us. And that means we now are part of the Alexander the Great Empire, the Macedonian Empire, which is part of the Greek peninsula. So it's bringing in, we're going to talk about this more, Greek culture into the area. And when Alexander dies in 323 BCE, he was quite young when he died, we then became part of the Ptolemaic Empire, which is a great Scrabble word. The Ptolemaic Empire, which was based in Egypt and run by one of his generals, Ptolemy. And the Ptolemy Empire down in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire up in Asia, in Syria, Turkey, that area, they fight back and forth with each other. And guess what's between them? Us. So in the early years, we swapped back and forth like 5 times or something. And then eventually the Ptolemies get us. And then that stays like that for a while. But then there's more wars back and forth. And by 201 BCE, the Seleucids take us. And now we're part of their empire. Done. Got that? All right. Now, during all of this period, both under the Ptolemies and then also under the Seleucids, there is this rush of Greek culture that is coming in. Remember, the Persians, they weren't big about pushing their culture, but the Greek culture, even though these people aren't Greek, but some of their leaders still are, but most of the average people aren't Greek. The Greek culture is kind of their main tool of propaganda, their main tool of getting people to work together. So they are founding cities that are in Greek styles, and they are promoting Greek lifestyles. Now, the Ptolemies did this kind of gently, and the Seleucids used to do it gently, but eventually we get a guy called Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who decides to push it. And that leads to the Maccabees. That leads to Hanukkah. So in 168 BCE, we revolt against their forcing the policies of Hellenism against us. And there were Jews on both sides. There were some Jews who thought that going Greek was a great thing. And there were other Jews who thought, no, we can't give up our ways, our path. Remember, all the way back to creation, there's this idea that we have a particular path. We've been fighting to achieve something, to still survive, to exist, to have this connection to God. We're not going to give it up now just because they've got good gymnasiums. So we end up with the War of the Maccabees. And the Maccabees eventually win. And they win independence-ish for the first time since the Babylonians. And they control a tiny little kingdom. I mean, it's like take Jerusalem and just draw a circle around it. And that's pretty much all they've got. But they're free, kind of, because they were still back and forth under rule by the Seleucids. Sometimes they had to make treaties, and sometimes they had to pay them off, and then sometimes they would be left alone. But we were sort of free. And during this time period, the kings were called the Hashmoneans. And the Hashmoneans were the people who came from the Maccabees. That was their family name. Like Maccabee was their battle name, and Hashmoni was their family name. Like, you know, Neely is my family name. So these guys are the descendants of the Maccabees. And they're not always so good. They conquer more territory eventually. They push out, as the Seleucid Empire has its own civil wars, they push out their territory and control more space. But they are not really great leaders overall for us. For one thing, they combine the kings and the priesthood together. Now, remember, the kingship is supposed to be from Judah and then from David, and the priests are supposed to be from Aaron, meaning the Kohens. You can't be from both families, right? Because you get your family identity for your tribe from your dad, and you can't have two fathers. So when they combine this, it creates a perfect opportunity for corruption, because now you don't have two powers to balance each other. You don't have a high priest and a king that can sort of keep each other in line. You have a high priest king who can do whatever he feels like. And this begins to create a lot of problems. And as they become more and more unsteady, two brothers, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, and if you think those sound like Greek names, you're right. Because by this point, they have begun, it's only 100 years later, they've already begun adopting a lot of Hellenism. So the people who came from the family that fought against the Greeks, Greek life, are now becoming more and more Greek-like. They're still Jewish, but they're adopting more and more of Greek culture. It's amazing how quickly in 100 years this has changed. And they're fighting for the throne. I mean, fighting, throw down armies kind of fighting. And eventually each of them asked Rome to help. And Rome eventually, there's a lot more detail, but eventually picks Hyrcanus because they think he's weaker. And then that means they can control him better. So they pick him, they say, you're going to be in charge of this area. And in 63 BCE, they formally take Judea and say, this is now part of our empire. So we had a little tiny 100-year period where we were kind of free. And now we're under the empire again. And the next time that we're going to be free is formally with our own state is 1948. Long time in between the 63 and 1948. But during that whole time, there was no independent Jewish state. We are going to eventually talk about some types of Jewish independence that there was during the middle. It wasn't completely like we were always, slaves, but this was the end. And as you can see, the end happened because of our fighting. Right? It was because our kings couldn't decide who got to be king that we ended up being put under Roman control. And the Romans eventually decide that these Hashmonean guys are too much trouble anyway. And so by 37 BCE, they help Herod, who's only kind of sort of Jewish, become the new king of Judea. And that way he is their favorite puppet to be in charge of this area. And that means that the Hashmoneans are done. Well, they're done after Herod kills them all. He kills his wife, who was one of the princesses of the Hashmonean family. He kills his own children because they were from her, and so they might have challenged him because they were more legitimate heirs to the throne. And he kills other people as well to make sure that no one is going back to the Hashmoneans. Yeah, Herod wasn't a nice guy. He did a really big upgrade to the temple. And when you go to Jerusalem now, you can still see the walls that he built. You all, of course, know about the Western Wall in Jerusalem, right? That was Herod's. He built that. When you're looking at those stones, you're looking at the stones he put there 2,000 years ago, which was nice. But let's be honest, he wasn't doing it for God. He was doing it so that people would say, wow, look what Herod built. And that's exactly why people still called him Herod the Great, even though he wasn't such a great guy. But people often are surprised by this, but the Jews were not very peaceful with this whole Roman occupation thing. We caused them a lot of trouble. There were many little revolts, and then eventually between 66 and 70 CE, you had the Great Revolt. This was the massive uprising of the people, and we lost. And when we lost, the temple was destroyed. And that is in 70 CE, that was the last time there was a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And that kicks off now a new period of rethinking ourselves. It still takes a while. There are still some groups who want to fight, and we get another revolt in 115 CE. We get another revolt in 132 to 135 CE led by a guy called Bar Kokhba, who many people thought might be Mashiach, might be the Messiah. He wasn't, because we know that because he lost. He also, at least by the rabbinic stories, wasn't a very nice person. And once this happens, the Romans are like, all right, you Jewish people are too much trouble. we need to throw some heavy laws on you. We need to carry off hundreds of thousands of you as slaves. We actually ruin the slave market because there are too many slaves. We push down the price of slaves. And this really makes life in the land of Israel much, much harder. Now, many Jews do live. The community does still survive, even though many have now left. And during this time period, before it finally breaks, before the community finally becomes bankrupt by all these policies, this is when the Judaism that we recognize, the modern form of Judaism, becomes reality. Because it's during this time that the Mishnah is written. It's during this time that the early Midrash and explanation of the Torah is finally written down so that we still have a record of it. It doesn't get lost. And it's during this time that people begin to see that the real focus has to be on the performance of mitzvot, on your personal devotion and spirituality, on your service to the community, and your deep study of the texts in order for all of that to lead you to live in the right way, to live your best life. And that happens in this shadow, if you will, of the Roman destruction. And that is what will now enable Jews to keep living for the next 2,000 years. Again, there are miracles that happen at all of these different points, because at each branch in the history, we should have been gone, right? When Isaac and Ishmael split, that should have been the end. When we went down to Egypt and became slaves, that should have been the end. Or even if we didn't become the slaves, we should have just stayed in Egypt and become Egyptian. Each of these different points, there should have been the end written, rather than all the way up to now, thousands of years after we began. But at each of these points, we also adapt and we learn from our mistakes, like our conversation about King David. We learned that what we were doing was wrong and how to improve. We're not perfect. We never have gotten it 100% right. But that transformation of learning of what are we going to do differently next time is one of the reasons we're still here. And we're not going to go into any more history tonight, because that's going to be for next week. So questions are now open for questions.
I was going to ask, do you feel that these occurrences where you say there was different miracles here and here and here, that there's ultimately a mission that has to be fulfilled, and so they can't be killed off completely?
Exactly.
Okay, they can be pressured, and then you end up losing a bunch, but there's always enough, whatever necessary, to continue forward. Then maybe more are killed off, but still there's still a core to it. There's still a mission that has to be fulfilled no matter what happens.
The technical term we use is remnant. There will always be a remnant left over, and it's kind of like a plant. That part of the plant may be killed, and you have to take the branch and you move it over here, but that tree is going to regrow. And then there may be another problem, and you have to take the branches and move them over there, and the tree is going to keep regrowing. Or it's kind of like yogurt. The bacteria in yogurt keeps going forever and ever and ever if you transfer it into a new pot, and that's how you make yogurt. Sourdough bread, same thing. And so there's always a remnant of Israel. There's, like you said, because there is a mission. And that's why when we go all the way back to the earliest prophets, even though they were giving warnings and even though they said everything's going to go bad, they also kept reminding us that even if it goes bad, because we don't listen, there will eventually be a redemption. There will eventually be another end. And they can see that because they understand better than we do, because I only can see up until the slide that I make for now, but they could see all the way through that God created the world in order that it would reach the final destination, where a full redemption of the world, where humanity as a whole finally gets it, and we have an important part to play in helping that happen. And that means that within the limits of free will, so we can still make mistakes and other people can still make mistakes, there will always be us to continue to pick up the pieces, to learn from the mistake, and to rebuild so that the mission can continue. It's a setback, and it would have been nice if we had all gotten it right a couple thousand years ago, but that inevitability is there. But it's not inevitable that it will be simple or comfortable. That's up to us. right? We will get to the final destination. How we travel there, that's still within our choice. So yes, and we're going to see many more incidences throughout the next 2,000 years of history where we should have disappeared from the world stage, but we don't. And like you say, it's because we have this important mission.
When King David made Bathsheba for the first time, that's a good example that she's makes bed. She made it the bed.
It's likely, yes. It doesn't say it clearly, but the Midrash seems to imply that she had just come from the mikveh. Yeah.
Nida, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's also how we knew that the baby was his and not her husband's.
Okay. Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
So talking about the intermingling, because all throughout this process, there has been a tremendous intermingling. So even though there have been some that have fallen off this path,
correct.
Okay, there have been others that through their origin have kind of awakened back to
who have joined, exactly.
Have come back because they felt that they had to be a part of this.
Exactly right.
And we have that process still continuing today.
Yes.
Where you have all coming from all different cultures, but feeling their necessity with a core group.
And that's the thing where we needed that core to begin, which is why when we finally had that transition with the sons of Jacob, where they stuck together rather than fragmenting, that now that the core was there, more could be pulled into the core, more could join and be part of that, rather than simply being just about the babies being born within that group. Because now that you have this nucleus, you are able to build much more strongly around that. And that has been a huge part of Jewish history. That's why when you look around the world, you see Jews who all look different than each other. We don't all look the same, despite what anti-Semites think and despite what people draw in cartoons about Jews. We are a pretty diverse group. And that's because we haven't, intermingled just to hang out. It's because we have met people around the world who want to be part of this plan, this mission, whose spirit sings with Judaism and say, yes, this is my story. I want this to be part of me. And they join. And that's been one of our strengths, is that we have not only been a family, we have had this ability to allow others to become part of the family.
1948.
Yes.
Talk about 1948. That made the state of Israel.
Right.
But actually, that's the same year Abraham born.
Depending upon how you count it. I mean, the terms of Abraham, the dates for all of that are open to a lot of debate, right? Because the Torah doesn't give us perfectly clear chronology of everything back that far. There have been some people who have tried to come up with a list, but even the most famous lists of the dates that go back to Abraham, not everyone agrees on. So there's no universally agreed upon calendar for Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all of that. We've got ranges. We know about when they lived. But when people try to get down to exactly this year, there's at least 10 other people who disagree, who put it 1 year before, 1 year after. So it never fits perfectly when people try to do that.
Perfectly.
No.
But if we take like a count from Adam, and you start to Adam, start to you come.
But there's overlap.
It's not.
But there's always overlap, right? Because when it says, for example, that someone has a kid when they're 90 years old, was that at the beginning of when they were 90 or at the end of when they were 90, right? So there's always going to be wiggles. Exactly. When we finally get up to the years like the Assyrians, like 722 and 586, those we can get because now we have 2 points of information. We have the Tanakh and we have archaeology, and we can use them to find the actual date. So then it becomes clearer. But unfortunately, we have no archaeology for Abraham because he didn't build a giant city with his name carved on it, because that wasn't what Abraham was doing. The Assyrians, they built giant cities with their names carved on them. Of course, the Assyrians are gone, and we're still here.
As we technologically advanced, then there was actual, documentation of the process.
Yes, that was a little bit clearer and more reliable. In fact, you can go to the British Museum in London, and you can see many of the Assyrian, they're part of the gates, the inscriptions, and it has all their history on it, and a lot of that history is about beating up us. And I'll tell you, it's very surreal to stand in front of this and say, this is the monument they built for conquering us, but I'm standing here, a free living Jew, and their empire and their culture is totally gone.
But I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Is it actually from that date?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. The British Empire, when they went around the world, they dug up amazing things and then took them back to London. So you have the real inscriptions that they dug up.
It's true that they have the mummy for the pharaoh.
Oh, they have many mummies. I mean, it's like you go in the British Museum, it's just like a whole room full of mummies.
They say
crazy.
I saw a rabbin explain that they take one of the mummy and they weigh the heart, and the heart weigh more than the whole body.
No, I've never heard that.
You know
No.
I heard that.
It's an interesting idea. I don't buy it. I don't buy it.
I heard that. I heard that from our rabbi.
Yeah.
So you just go into the museum and you'll be able to see all that.
Yep. You can go online and see a lot of it too. But the British Museum is one of the best places to go to see the wonders of the world, because the British Empire brought a lot of those wonders back to London. And it's a free museum. You just walk in and just explore. So yeah, it's pretty amazing, because when we went there the last time with the kids, like, this is the Rosetta Stone, right? This is the real one, right? This isn't a picture. This isn't a reproduction. That's the real one. And thanks to this, we understand Egyptian history, because it gave us the key to translate hieroglyphics. And and this depiction here, see that's Lachish. That's when they were attacking the Jewish city. And that's the battering ram that was knocking down the walls. And, it's just incredible. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Which finishes us for today.
Thank you, Roy.
Take care.